Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies and distinguished guests. We will allow some time for all of our guests to take their seats. Thank you once again for joining us on the third and final plenary session. The Seoul Defense Dialogue has been looking at a wide range of themes and topics. Yesterday, we looked at the denuclearization of North Korea, as well as fostering peace and security, as well as cooperation within the Indo-Pacific. And today, we will be looking at the third plenary session topic of the role in military and hybrid warfare. So with that, let us begin the third plenary session and allow me to introduce our moderator. Our moderator will be Professor Hyun Lee, the Associate Dean of Law at the Handong International Law School. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator with a big round of applause. And now, the chair, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning and welcome to this third and final session, plenary session of the Seoul Defense Dialogue. This topic this morning is the role of the military in hybrid warfare. Now, the term hybrid warfare, of course, was coined in this century, but the tactics of hybrid warfare, as many of you know, distinguished military officers understand that it has been used for a long time. But the question of hybrid warfare in this context, of course, is very timely and salient given the events that are happening in the Ukraine. And so here we have this morning a distinguished panel of experts who will be able to explain and also tell us about trends and other aspects of hybrid warfare that have come up in the past few years. And so a lot to do is to introduce our panel and then discuss the event session this morning. To my left is Mr. David Van Wiel, who is the Assistant Secretary of General for Emerging Security Challenges for Nato. And to his left is Mr. Kusti Salm, who is the Permanent Secretary of the Estonian Ministry of Defense. To his left is Professor Jung Gu-yeon of Gangwon National University. To her left is Dr. Lee Kang-gyu, who is the Chair of Defense Strategy Division for the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. And lastly, to his left is Mason Ritchie, who is Professor of the Graduate School of International and Area Studies of Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Now, as a procedural note, we will be giving each panel member 5 minutes for their opening remarks, and which will be followed by the key questions to be followed, which I will ask panel members to address. And time permitting, we will allow for questions from the floor to be asked to the panel. So, Mr. Van Wiel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and you called me an expert, but I have to temper your expectations. I call myself a professional that is burdened with hybrid warfare, but the experts will follow later on in the row. So it's a pleasure to be here at the Seoul Defense Dialogue and to talk about NATO's efforts in countering hybrid threats. The NATO leaders met in June this year at a summit in Madrid, and it was one of the most important summits since NATO was formed in 1949, setting strategic direction for the future following the fundamental change in the security environment that happened on the 24th of February of this year. But what does this fundamental change mean in terms of hybrid warfare? The summit declaration and our strategic concept highlighted hybrid threats in an unprecedented way for NATO. Why? Because we are faced, and I mean not just NATO and NATO allies, but also you and all of us with a significant challenge. Authoritarian actors test our resilience and seek to exploit the openness, the interconnectedness, and the digitalization of our nations. They interfere in our democratic processes and institutions, and they target the security of our citizens through hybrid tactics, both directly and through proxies. They conduct malicious activities in cyberspace. They promote disinformation campaigns, instrumentalize migration, manipulate energy and food supplies, and employ economic coercion. These actors are also at the forefront of a deliberate effort to undermine multilateral norms, institutions, and rules-based international order, and to promote instead of that authoritarian models of governance. The central challenge, therefore, will be a strategic competition with revisionist and rogue regimes and actors that have become very skilled at operating below the threshold of armed conflict to advance their strategic interest. Hybrid warfare for us has become the new normal, and it affects societies at many levels. What is really new is the speed, the scale, and the intensity of hybrid attacks, facilitated by rapid technological change and global interconnectivity. Hybrid warfare is being operationalized as we speak by Russia against Ukraine, while they are also maintaining a very close focus on conventional forces. And let me give you some examples. Russia has been using energy as a tool of pressure against Ukraine long before the current war of aggression. This included gas price hikes, supply cuts, the seizure of Ukraine's coal reserves, and offshore gas rigs in the Black Sea, as well as cyber attacks against the electricity infrastructure. And what we can see now, very recently, is that the focus of Russia's coercive use of energy has expanded beyond Ukraine. The Kremlin is manipulating gas supplies to Europe to put political pressure. And although this might lead to a difficult winter in Europe, longer-term effects remain to be seen. As Europe diversifies away from Russian energy, such a strategy could also bring more negative consequences for Russia itself. I've also mentioned cyber. With Ukraine, the world was able to see not only a kinetic war, but also a digital one. The magnitude of the pre-kinetic destructive operations, or wipers, has been unprecedented. The range of targets in Ukraine were hit, rendering computer systems of multiple government, military, and critical sectors inoperable, which was relevant for Ukrainian military capacity. In addition, these attacks were aiming at undermining trust and spreading fear. We've also seen effects spilling over within and beyond the region, as for example with the cyber attacks on satellite communication systems that affected also NATO allies. A very similar modus operandi is used regarding continuous and massive disinformation campaigns in Ukraine and globally. And those campaigns do immediate damage amongst our population before we can set the record straight. Modern technology, social networks, the use of bots and AI to target people are not only changing the concept of disinformation, but are changing the speed and the reaction. On the other side, we see we have no access at all to, for example, the Russian information sphere. So how is NATO addressing these challenges of hybrid warfare? Countering hybrid threat is a long-term strategic challenge for NATO and its allies. And already in 2015, we adopted a strategy on countering hybrid warfare. And since then, we've been consistently improving our approach to hybrid threats. And I'll give you some examples. First, and certainly one of the most important, is that we've enhanced national and alliance-wide resilience. These efforts allow us to ensure that military forces are at all times adequately supported with civilian resources and infrastructure, to reduce vulnerabilities and dependencies, including with respect to our infrastructure and supply chains. And as NATO is moving towards a whole-of-society approach, we are ensuring that all stakeholders are contributing to national resilience. This includes the government, both civilian and military, the private sector, the non-profit sector, and our citizens themselves. The war in Ukraine shows that the defense of a nation is not only a job for the defense forces. Secondly, we're responding by developing and deploying counter-hybrid support teams. These teams consist of civilian and military experts that can be deployed to an ally that requests support, either in a crisis or to assist them in detecting hybrid vulnerabilities and mitigating them. In November 2019, the first counter-hybrid support team was deployed to Montenegro, then a new ally seeking to mitigate potential vulnerabilities to hybrid threats. And more recently, in September of 2021, we deployed a hybrid support team to Lithuania, which was then the target of a migration campaign waged by Belarus. This was a tangible demonstration of allied support and a demonstration that NATO is building response options below the threshold of the famous Article 5 in the North Atlantic Treaty, which deals with collective defense. Third, we've built a hybrid dimension into all exercises that we do. Hybrid threats cannot be separated from traditional military ones when we are exercising. Exercises help us building a shared civil-military understanding of the effects of these non-traditional threats in a war environment. Fourth, we've improved our cyber defenses. We've declared cyber as an operational domain, and we've produced a guide for strategic response options to significant malicious cyber activities. And we're enhancing our ability to operate effectively in cyberspace to prevent, detect, counter, and respond to the full spectrum of threats that we face, using all available tools. And then fifth, we've increased our situational awareness. Our intelligence division includes now a unit that deals specifically with monitoring and analyzing hybrid threats, so that we can better connect the dots and see what is coming towards us in the near future. We're becoming more agile to take decisions more rapidly and to respond to disinformation. A NATO website, which is called Setting the Record Straight, serves as a one-stop shop for all the myth-busting facts in several languages with regards to NATO. Countering hybrid threats is, as you can hear, a very broad undertaking. It's about improving NATO's military and civilian ability to better contest the gray zone. And this brings me to my last point, the importance of partnerships in tackling hybrid challenges. NATO cannot tackle hybrid challenges alone. The challenges we are facing today in hybrid warfare are not isolated to any one region or country, and addressing them requires engagement with partners. I'm very pleased to say that I feel that NATO partners are sharing this understanding. We are increasingly receiving requests from them for deeper cooperation exactly on the topics as countering hybrid and cyber threats, and increasing resilience against disinformation. In fact, we have difficulties in meeting the demands, and we will have to ramp up our capabilities. For us, partnerships are crucial to protect the global commons, enhance our resilience, and uphold the rules-based international order. NATO is committed to strengthening the ties with partners that share the alliance's values and interests. And for example, the Indo-Pacific is important for NATO, given that developments in this region can directly affect Euro-Atlantic security. Such international cooperation, together with the enhanced civil-military cooperation and the cooperation with industry, is a necessity to successfully respond to hybrid threats today. In responding to hybrid warfare, NATO is not operating in a vacuum or uncharted territories. The existing international rules, including the existing international law, provide the framework in which we operate. To conclude, at NATO, we are countering hybrid warfare in a holistic manner. And bringing together so many stakeholders, civilian and military, is not an easy task. Forging trust and achieving the necessary continuous adaptation and engagement requires extensive efforts. But it's also this exact process and the culture of cooperation and ever-giving consensus and political dialogue among allies and partners that makes us strong. We were successful by working together in this way for more than 70 years, and our family is still expanding with Sweden and Finland. And we continue to be united in our commitment to democracy, individual liberty, human rights, and the rule of law. We adhere to international law and to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. We are committed to upholding the rules-based international order, and we are looking forward to do it in concert with all like-minded partners. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Van Wiel. Now we will turn to Mr. Salm. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you and good morning. First, let me start by thanking the Korean Minister of National Defense. It's an excellent dialogue. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for the leadership. I think the recent years have indicated that the global problems need global solutions, and it's incredible to see such a large group of different nations here. So thank you very much for this. The name of the panel, Role of Military in Hybrid Warfare. I think this is the question that has been hammering our heads, at least in Estonia. Before the Ukrainian war and certainly after the war started, is there a role? What does it mean? And is the influence of hybrid as large as we have all been speaking about in the last 10 to 15 years? Well, I can give you an Estonian example. as we prepared for the incursion in Ukraine that became imminent in December. We knew that hybrid is in the toolbox of Russian Federation. We knew it because they launched the cyber attacks against us in 2007 that everyone is aware of. Everyone is also aware of that Russian cyber attacks have become commonplace, well, basically all around the world. Energy. David mentioned that energy has been a tool in their security policy toolbox for, in Ukraine, at least for 10 years. Nord Stream 2 was, to a 50% extent, a tool for imposing your security defense interests. Migration, as David mentioned. About the same time last year, the Russian Federation and Belarus imposed the most serious hybrid attack against sovereign nations in the last 30 years in Lithuania and Poland, dispatching thousands of illegal migrants on the borders of these nations. That led Lithuanians to put more than 1,000 soldiers on the borders, and in fact Poland employed around 10,000 troops on their border, military troops, until this spring. So it all made sense that when they start a war in one country, they want to occupy our bandwidth, our decision-making power, our time, our attention to hybrid threats, to create strategic dilemmas for the governments in order to make achieving of their goals in Ukraine faster. But you know what? Nothing of this happened. And I think this is a question that remains to be revealed for historians. I think they're still struggling with how exactly the Second World War started, 70, 80 years later. And I'm sure that it's the same with Korean War and so forth. But there are two questions that are imminently in our heads. First, did they not do it because they were incapable of doing this? Or secondly, they didn't do it because they were deterred by spilling over the conflict into the alliance, Nato, so forth. Well, certainly we don't know this, but I'm looking for the panel to elaborate on this issue. But most certainly there are 4 conclusions, I think, that we can already make at the example of Ukrainian crisis on hybrid. First, if you take the conventional 3-headed axis of intent, capabilities and opportunity, and you attribute it to the threat scenarios that exist in Korean Peninsula, in Eastern Europe, in Taiwan, where intent and capabilities are always in place, at least in theory. And the only axis that is moving is opportunity. Then the atmosphere of hybrid threats makes finding opportunity much faster and much easier. COVID-19, a lot of disturbance around the world, making sense of your efforts makes it much, much faster. Energy disturbances in region and cross-region makes it much, much more easier to explain potential military incursion that otherwise would take months or years. And we know that Russian Federation and some other state actors around the world are extremely capable of doing this. Number one. Number two, hybrid attacks have immensely high return on investment, especially if we compare it with conventional military threats. Just give you two very simple examples. The same migrant flow threat or attack against Lithuania and Poland probably took Belarus and Russian effort worth a couple of million of euros. But the response that was needed by the whole alliance was worth hundreds of millions, and the bandwidth that actually took days and days of decision-making time. Or Russian Federation action in Africa, for example. Sending Wagner terrorist group to Mali took them a few million euros. But what it required from France and other European nations was basically sacrificing one of the highest policy goals that they had in foreign policy. Creating the equation marks between actions that don't really equal is something that provides very attractive opportunities for waging hybrid threats. Now, maybe the most important conclusion for Estonia in short term, and I'm sure that many other nations have the same conclusion. We cannot afford to put the hybrid threats into the same basket as conventional military threats and actions to prepare against this. Hybrid threats will never occupy a territory. Hybrid threats will never wipe off full cities from the map. Hybrid threats will never, make millions of people flee the country. Hybrid threats will never wipe off the economic growth of multiple generations in one country. So conventional threats are still the most important threats to prepare against, and especially in international community, we need to make sure that this is something that will be taken off the table and the deterrence works as it should be and how it has worked throughout the history. And fourthly, I think one of the assumptions the Russian Federation had in Ukraine, and they had in waging all sorts of hybrid threats around the world, is that creating disturbance in the West or in the like-minded nations around the world will push allies apart. Well, what actually happened was that it pulled them more together. And it showcases it again and again. The harder the times, the closer the cooperation and the closer the unity. And I'm quite confident this is how it works also from here. So thank you very much, and looking forward for the questions and further discussion.
All right, thank you, Mr. Salm. Now we will turn the floor to Professor Zhang, who will give her remarks.
Thank you, moderators. And I would like to thank Ministry of Defense of Republic of Korea for inviting me to this prestigious conference of this year. So let me start with two kind of observations that I have from the case of Ukraine crisis, but not just limited to that case. Well, hybrid warfare is kind of prevalent at this moment, and we see more of them rather than just traditional and conventional warfares or sometimes civil wars. And the first thing that I want to discuss and point out is that the goal of hybrid warfares, and many panelists have kind of emphasized that it is intended to kind of goal of subversion, undermine the authority of a target state, and kind of weakening the existing norms and institutions and national orders. But as you can see from this case of Ukraine crisis, it could be a kind of overture to a longer war of traditions, and sometimes it invites kinetic warfare as well. And also, as we can see from this Ukraine crisis, it is crossing the different domains of warfares, and sometimes it's kind of hard to, for a kind of defender, it is very hard to deter the aggressor's motivation without escalating crisis. So in that sense, it provides a kind of challenges, not only for the military, but also for the kind of international legal system to cope with, properly cope with this hybrid warfares. We really clearly not identify the role, kind of motivations of hybrid warfares and the aggressors in the whole process of hybrid warfares. And the second observation that I have, and I'll also share, is that current hybrid warfares, democracies are very vulnerable to that hybrid threat. In that sense, that it is democracy is inherently vulnerable to hybrid threat because of its own characteristics, such as free and open media, which many panelists have emphasized that disinformation warfares and cyber warfares are kind of intervening in that characteristics, and pluralism, state restraint, and also freedom of assembly make democracies very vulnerable to hybrid threats. Of course, hybrid threat has not have like one-size-fits-all approach in kind of conducting their warfares. they are using specific vulnerability of each target state. But when you look at the current trend of hybrid warfares, it is the democracies that become the target, and it becomes the easier target for the hybrid warfares. And especially these days, many European countries, and especially Asian countries as well, we are undergoing a political polarization as well, which becomes a very facilitating environment for an aggressor to conduct hybrid warfares. So these two observations are actually leading up to the kind of discussion that we're going to have throughout this panel, I guess. What's kind of role of the military and the international law in responding to these hybrid warfares? Well, of course, as many panelists have emphasized, this hybrid warfare does not just include kind of non-conventional, conventional, or peacetime and wartime kind of distinctions. They are kind of including every aspect of warfares that can take the advantage of this target country's vulnerability. So we can't have like a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. But at the same time, when you look at this kind of hybrid crisis escalating process, we might want to think about how military can set the kind of red lines, and militaries can kind of share the information about how these hybrid warfares are across the world kind of conducted by the aggressors these days, which might give us a very nice starting point to discuss how to respond to these hybrid warfares. And especially when it comes to this blurring line between these hybrid warfares, like blurring the line between peace and war, hard and soft security, and man-on-man threats, this is very difficult for the civilian kind of actors to identify how to respond to this warfare. So to clearly identify the threat, understand the motivation of aggressors, it is very important for the military and also civilian actors, and also as a kind of intelligence community, as a kind of share information to detect, attribute these ongoing hybrid activities as well. And for the military especially, to deter the aggressor's intervention in the military domain, this cross-domain deterrence and de-escalation strategies and corresponding international coordination is very important. And of course, that is the kind of point of domain where international cooperation is needed. And for instance, like domains such as civil preparedness and chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear incident response, infrastructure protection, strategic communication, and cyber defense, all of these different domains, and which is kind of leading up to this kinetic warfares, is the point where military's roles are pretty important in kind of coordinating to respond to hybrid warfares as well. So I will stop here, and we're going to discuss more in the later part.
Great. Thank you, Professor Zhang. And now we will have Dr. Lee with his opening remarks. Dr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, moderator, and thank you for having me today. It was such a great honor for me to be here with many distinguished guests and panelists in defense and security community around the world. Since other panelists nicely introduced and explained the various aspects of hybrid warfare, I'd like to briefly touch on the characteristics of hybrid warfare and the role of the military in the age of this hybrid warfare. My understanding is that hybrid warfare is based on the concept of employing every means possible. The thing is that this every means has become really every. So in this context, having witnessed the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think the hybrid war makes war like such as so-called everyone's war. So it's the age of everyone's war we witness these days. I do believe many of you here clearly remember the shock of Gulf War in 1991 or so. That was a very big shock to me too. So when I watch the television, I feel like I was there. So like this, the Gulf War totally changed the concept of war, modern war. And this time, the war between the Ukraine and the Russia brought war to your hands, into your hands, on your smartphones. It means that everybody can join this war easily just by opening their apps and clicking them. In this sense, in a traditional war and in the conventional war, the people usually were the audience and targets, especially in terms of psychological warfare and information warfare. They were the subject to be mobilized by the state or government for the resources for the war. But these days, in the age of hybrid warfare, people are players in hybrid warfare. They are very, very active players. In this context, we have to think about the advancement of technology and the fourth industrial revolution. And these very developed technologies enables people to join this war. For example, you can just use your cell phones and mobile phones, just clicking the apps. You can track flights and ships by using tracking apps. And you can locate the forces by using the map or GPS applications. You can keep watch the moves of troops by using the surveillance apps. Even you can send some money to Ukraine, I mean the cryptocurrency, by using trading or banking apps. And even a billionaire could join this war by using his Starlink system. That's the characteristics of this hybrid warfare. It makes war very easily joined, and it invites everyone to join this war. So the concept of war has been changing from their wars and our wars up to my war. However, I think this hybrid warfare has some dilemmas too. The first dilemma is about asymmetry between the attack side and the defense side. It might be true that more connected and more networked and more highly technologically developed societies are likely to have more resources to be employed for this hybrid warfare, such as very smart hackers, highly advanced equipment and hardware, and very well-educated citizens who can check the facts. And all of those can be served as a very good resources for the hybrid warfare. On the other hand, these very highly connected and networked and technological advanced societies are also likely to be very vulnerable to attacks in hybrid warfare. It's kind of to both sides of the same coin. The second dilemma is regarding the role of the military. I think there are 3 points for this second dilemma. The first is that the civilian and military relations, which has been a long topic in political science. I believe many of you are very familiar with this topic. But we have to see the different aspects of these civilian and military relations in hybrid warfare. Because of the importance of hybrid warfare in modern war, we have to fight with this hybrid warfare. We have to fight against this hybrid warfare. But the thing is that who we are, who should be we? The military or civilian or both? It should be a very tricky issue for us. And the role of military is broad by the fact that, as I told you before, everyone can join this war. Everyone can employ many means to conduct this war. So many just ordinary people can be a warrior in cyber warfare, information warfare, and public opinion warfare. So in this sense, we have to think about the problem and difficult how to draw a line between the military and the civilian. I know there are many variety types of civilian-military relations in every country. Every country has its own unique historical background, experience, and political situations which have established their own style of the military and civilian relations. But it's time to think about this one, how to draw a line between these two quite different camps to make this hybrid war more effective and more clear. The other point is that the adequate response to these hybrid warfare attacks. Everybody knows the cyber attacks is very tricky to find out. It's kind of located in the gray zone. So if there is a cyber attack, you have to think about it's kind of a part of a war or just ordinary cyber attack, non-military activities. So people have to determine whether it is the beginning of a war or just the ordinary cyber attacks which can be categorized into just a cyber crime. So the drawing a line between these two are also very complicated matter we have to explore and delve into. And the last point is that who is more capable doing this hybrid warfare? Who has more resources? The military or civilians? If the military wants to cover much of hybrid warfare, that's good, but it could be overreached and I think fails to focus on its own and unique and original task to fight a war. If the military wants to outsource this hybrid warfare to the civilians, that's good too, but in this sense, the military is likely to lose its presence in this warfare. So that's very important and very difficult question we have to solve and tackle these days. And that's what I have to share with you today, and thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Dr. Lee. Lastly, we will have Professor Ritchie to give his opening remarks.
Hello and good morning. I'm going to start with the obligatory profession of gratitude to the organizers and the staff of the Ministry of National Defense and also of the Sejong Institute for organizing this and for inviting me and my fellow panelists. I'm the last speaker on the last panel of the last day, so I'm either going to do a good job of this and we'll leave on a high note, or I'll make a total hash of it, in which case you'll mercifully be released back into your normal lives. So with that, I'll get into it. Very first thing I'm going to say out of my 4 points, really is, why engage in hybrid threats in the first place? Why would an aggressor not simply begin with conventional attack? In this sense, the answer in the first place is that the objective of hybrid attack is to degrade an adversary through measures, quote unquote, below the threshold of military conflict, but also below the threshold of retaliation, and usually therefore below the threshold of escalation. These include obviously subversion campaigns, influence operations, disinformation, sovereignty harassment, and border incursions, undermining of adversary political systems. We've already heard democracies considered to be particularly vulnerable in this regard, infrastructure deterioration and disruption, cyber attack, et cetera. However, as Permanent Secretary Salm alluded to, hybrid attacks alone are unlikely to lead to strategic success. If we want to refer to that in terms of territorial control or even functional control over parts of another state. But they can do wear down and weaken an attack target, perhaps prior to some decisive kinetic involvement, if it's necessary, through military conflict. So the sort of bottom line up front, and I guess the most important takeaway, in my estimation, from everything I'm going to say, is that the most critical defense against hybrid threats is really two things. The first of which, and I think we've heard several speakers talk about it on the panel, and also yesterday Ambassador Volvin mentioned it in his talk about disinformation. Whole of government, whole of society, national resilience. That approach is, I think, the best defense in the first place. And this is, involves socioeconomic egalitarianism, equality of opportunity, viable incorporation of minorities into your social fabric and into your socio-political culture, private sector and government cooperation, civil-military cooperation and respect, technical, obviously, expertise, notably in the cyber domain, of course, military support where it's necessary and appropriate, for instance, through countering cyber attacks, border and ADIZ incursions, sovereignty harassment. These are elements of deterrence as well as mitigation. They're also extremely hard, which goes back to the point I think we heard one of the speakers refer to the high return on investment in hybrid attacks, which is, of course, one of the other reasons why they take place. The second thing is international cooperation among like-minded partners through sharing threat perceptions and best practices, concerted appeal to international law, and supporting vulnerable states. This can include military-to-military cooperation, as, for instance, we heard with respect to NATO supporting Lithuania. Second point I want to make, hybrid threats, of course, are on a spectrum. They blur the lines of the legal and the illegal, peace and aggression. They go from the low end, let's say certain forms of coercive statecraft or deep fakes, up through gray zone, below the threshold conflict. For instance, the Russian use of the paramilitary little green men in Russia, which uses this sort of implausible deniability as a way of sending a message that's below the threshold. And then, of course, moving into hybrid warfare itself, which is a military-driven and potentially kinetic conflict that uses hybrid and non-military components. Third, to really get to the point of this session, what is the military role in hybrid warfare? So in the first place, I think we heard two of the members of the panel already mention it, so I'll go through it quickly. Obviously, the military force can cap a below-the-threshold campaign, right? This would be an attempt to bring it to a successful strategic conclusion for an aggressor whose objective is either reflexive, functional, or territorial control over a part of a target state. Russian actions in Georgia were strategically successful in this regard with respect to, for instance, South Ossetia. And then we're seeing a replay of this in some form in Ukraine, which so far has been strategically unsuccessful or at least indeterminate until now. Of course, this use of military force as a capper on a hybrid campaign, continues to perhaps use other hybrid forms of attack, such as cyber attacks, psychological operations, et cetera. Secondly, military assets can have a role, of course, in below-the-threshold hybrid operations, aiming at both military and non-military elements of the target state. So harassing military exercises, troop buildups on borders that feign kinetic attacks, frequent and regular ADIZ incursions, missile tests with reckless flight paths or splashdown zones, illegal commercial shipping and fishing interference by Navy or Coast Guard or Marine Force, illegal maritime territorial claims and alterations of disputed features, cyber attack by the military. And so among peer states, this behavior risks unwanted aggression. Among asymmetrically armed states, this behavior military innervates and potentially can weaken a target state over time. And then obviously, the other way that the military is involved in this, and I think both Permanent Secretary Salm and Mr. Van Weel referred to this, that the target state military has a right and an obligation, of course, to counter those operations by aggressor militaries, or an alliance in some case can have that obligation. Again, to talk about the hybrid threat support that was given by NATO to Lithuania, that's another example of that. So my concluding remarks, I guess, would be four brief things to repeat. First of all, the best defense against hybrid threats is national resilience and international cooperation with like-minded partners. This reduces the effectiveness of below-the-threshold actions, which increases the aggressor's cost and risk for follow-up kinetic attack, thus hopefully deterring it. Secondly, target states and their partners should be responsibly transparent about hybrid threats, acknowledge them, condemn them, explain the policies to counter them. I think a very salient example of that was the US release of intelligence prior to the Ukraine war. Now, unfortunately, not enough countries believed that US intelligence, perhaps even including Ukraine, unfortunately. But I think that's clearly a potential game changer in certain cases. Thirdly, new technologies will have a potentially uncertain effect on the prosecution, understanding, and prediction of hybrid warfare. The cybersecurity environment will evolve due to cryptography, AI, machine learning, and quantum computing. AI algorithms will predict certain aggressor behaviors. They will also allow aggressors to pick targets better. Open source intelligence and satellite imagery will make troop movements and material along borders more evident and more publicly visible. These technology changes, I think it's an open question to what extent they're going to be more advantageous to the aggressor or the defender, but I think that's something to look at going forward. And then my last point, we should all be prepared, I think, for more frequently being on the threshold of hybrid threats tipping over into hybrid warfare with further escalation risks. So I think my time is up, so I'll just stop there. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Ritchie. And I want to thank the panel for your opening remarks and for your very insightful observations about hybrid warfare. And now I would like to now move on to the questions for the panel. Now, what I've heard in terms of your opening remarks, particularly in terms of what hybrid warfare is, referencing kinetic versus non-kinetic activities, and then blurring the lines, particularly between the military and civilian technologies. And one question that's, of course, I think for us is, I think of interest is, and I think Professor Ritchie addressed some of these questions about styles of warfare or tactics. So I'd like to ask, what are the new warfighting styles that can be observed from modern hybrid warfare? Hybrid warfare being, of course, something which has been done for quite some time, but the fourth industrial revolution, the modern technologies, blurring the lines between biological, technological, physical even. What have you seen in terms of these new tactics and warfighting styles? So I'd like to maybe begin with maybe Mr. Van Wiel. Maybe if you can just address the first, and then we can go through the panel.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that's one of the things that we're only beginning to scratch the surface on what new technologies, and then especially emerging and disruptive technologies, will bring to warfare in general, but hybrid warfare specifically. If you look at the war in Ukraine, then I will give an example of both sides where we see new technologies play a role. First, from the Russian side, we see that there's a continuous disinformation campaign being waged on Western fora like Twitter, making use of AI in targeting specific groups, having large groups of bots pushing a certain message for propaganda purposes. On the Ukrainian side, I'll also give an example where we see that Ukrainian hackers, or they're not actually hackers, they're more WizKids, are using apps like Tinder to gain the interest of Russian soldiers that are in camps in Ukraine, tempting them to send pictures, from which pictures they are geolocating the stationing of Russian troops and providing that information to Ukrainian artillery. So those are just two examples of where new technologies, in this case AI and big data, are making their entrance into the warfare. I can only begin to fathom what technologies like biotechnology, human enhancement, the increase of autonomy will do in this sphere. The common denominator is, however, I think that it is not a purely military realm anymore. In Ukraine, we can see it is definitely a civil effort. It is a whole of society effort to defend the country, and the rules have not been defined for that yet. Should we then delineate more between civil and military? We've heard that question being asked. I think it's very, very difficult to do so. We will have to acknowledge that in order to counter cyber attacks, that a company like Microsoft is far more able and capable than any of our militaries will ever be in countering such attacks. So instead of trying to clearly delineate what is military, what is civil, we might need to accept that in future of warfare, there will be no clear delineation, but there needs to be clear cooperation, and there needs to be clear rules of the road. So how do we feel in warfare that we can responsibly make use of these new technologies? That is something that from a NATO perspective we're very engaged in. We're trying to develop responsibles of principal use For example, for artificial intelligence, what do we find acceptable in artificial intelligence and what do we find undesirable because it doesn't compete with our democratic values? And on that basis, if we could come to international agreements on that, I think at least we would make future warfare as bound by international law as it is now. Otherwise, I'm afraid for a bit of a wild, wild west.
Well, thank you for the answer. Now, I guess from a country perspective, now I think Mr. Salm, you'd be a good person to address this issue, what you've seen, given your perspective being in Estonia. So, would you mind addressing the first question?
Yeah, of course. First of all, from the technological side, David mostly answered the question. Cyber AI information campaigns, it's hugely cheap ways of achieving a huge influence, especially in democratic societies. So I'm not going to go into these details. But what is fascinating for me is how the tactical sort of dilemmas. We were all aware of the Ukrainian villages, cities. We were all, with a great interest looking for destroyed tanks and APCs and so forth in the first days of the war. This was the tactical phase. I think now, or even a few months ago, we entered into this operational phase when we are making distinction of the Eastern Front and Southern Front, and we are observing what is going on there. But there is new, and I think when it comes to the end game, it's the most important front, that is the narrative front. Narrative front where, well, actually there is only one narrative. And the narrative is that one nation, Russian Federation, is illegally, well, basically conducting a war crime, occupying another country, using terrorist tactics and all this. This is the undisputed truth. But what has been discussed is an excellent example, the cleverness of Russian decision makers on creating narratives that don't really exist and imposing strategic dilemmas to the West and wider West. Let's just make the example of the sort of grain issue. The lack of grain export from Ukraine had nothing to do with Ukrainians. It had nothing to do with supply or logistic stumbling blocks in Ukraine. The only reason why there is an issue of grain is that Russia has waged a war on Ukraine. They have occupied the supply lines. They have disrupted this. And now they are presenting this as some sort of a decision-making point. That, of course, has a lot of appetite in many nations around the world, to put the equation mark on whether we want a peace in Ukraine or free trade of grain. Another example just a few weeks ago on Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Again, a lot of Western leaders jumped into the waters with their hands and legs open, going to solve the problem of nuclear escalation. Again, what was Ukrainian fault in this narrative? What did they do wrong that we all need to go and solve this? The sole purpose of this is that Russian occupied the territory of this nuclear plant and are causing the sort of nuclear hazardous situation. And again, another strategic dilemma imposed to the West that doesn't actually exist. And even here, speaking with my colleagues all around the world, I see that there are many other sort of dilemmas that have a lot of traction in domestic policies. Well, none of us needs to mention the energy that influences everyone. That has nothing to do with Ukraine. So it's unfair to put them on the spot picking between the peace in Ukraine or solution in other unrelated areas. But again, this is another example, another facet of the hybrid war and the cleverness of Russian Federation in distracting ourselves in their actual war crimes committed in Ukraine.
Great, thank you. We have the benefit of having three scholars with us, and from their presentations, they spoke about the cost effectiveness and being everyone's war, that the participation of civilians in the civilian sector, Mr. Van Weel made that reference in terms of Microsoft and technological companies. And so among the three of our scholars on the panel, Professor Jung, Dr. Lee, and Professor Ritchie, could you comment maybe on what you've seen as sort of new warfighting styles, if you have any comment?
Yeah, that's actually good questions, and related to the previous discussions about fourth industrial revolution technologies related to these questions as well. So both panelists talked about artificial intelligence, but the new technology not only include AI, but also 5G networks, as well as new kind of biological security technology as well. And the thing is that, as mentioned by the previous panelists, is that all of this new technology provides a gray area to which the international community respond in appropriate way, because the dilemma coming out of this issue is that first. These technological developments and adoption of this technology to hybrid warfares need to be understood in a clear way, but that's not, because first, there are different levels of technological development among countries, so they cannot agree with this kind of similar kind of prescriptions and similar kind of norms and rules about how to use this technology and how to manage this technology. That's the one thing. And the second thing is that because of that, they cannot come up with kind of how to make a legal way to manage the situations. As artificial intelligence case, there is no clear and consistent way how we can define in the first place about artificial intelligence or use of that in the military way, and what's the kind of prohibited way of in terms of conducting warfares. The second one is that, as mentioned by previous panelists, and this one has been clearly manifested in the Ukraine war, is that who is actually using this technology in terms of during the warfares? Is it civil actors or military actors, and whether they are kind of identifiable in the first place? That makes we can make very difficult to identify who is the aggressors and how we can address this situation in the first place. The third one, final one is that I mentioned about this cross-domain escalation during my previous comments, that these first industrial revolutions and technologies are kind of interrelated to the conventional warfares, as you can see from Ukraine crisis. And that is very hard to distinguish, and that is very difficult for a kind of normal and traditional military forces, whether we should escalate this crisis into another level, whether we should respond with conventional warfares, and whether we should think about stability in this area as well. So that makes all of these gray areas and inherent characteristic of hybrid warfares in tandem with this new technology makes very hard to respond for our international community. And so that's why it is very important, as many of the panelists will discuss later, and international communications about how we can respond to this hybrid warfare is very important. And the communication is the very beginning of this, our discussions about how to cope with hybrid warfares. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Dr. Lee or Professor Ritchie, if you have any comments to make, please.
Thanks. I regret that I too early came over what I have. So I do not want to reiterate what I'm saying from my opening remarks. I just add a very small thing for this characteristics of hybrid warfare. As the Professor Chang already mentioned, the technology is very important, especially artificial intelligence is the key for this hybrid warfare in the future, I think. But the thing is that, as we see the war between Russia and Ukraine, it's a really hybrid, I think, because it's so old-fashioned warfighting system, and the very advanced warfighting system is coexist. So like this, hybrid warfare is basically dependent on the traditional warfighting style. It is not independent. And it's just my imagination, but I'd like to share with you today is that in the long run, I mean the last version of hybrid warfare, should be the virtual war. The virtual means that AI on the one side, the other AI on the other side are fighting each other and doing war game in metaverse. So everybody crushed into this metaverse, fight for their own interests or their own states or their own organizations. I think that's the ultimate future of the hybrid warfare. But the fundamental for this ultimate version of hybrid warfare, the technology should be evolving and evolving. So we cannot guess what is the landscape in the future of hybrid warfare, but we can track the advancement and progress of technology, that we can see the part of it. Yeah, that's my point.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. And Professor Ritchie.
I'm mostly going to cede my time. I just want to second what Mr. Van Weel said. For instance, the use of data from civilian partisans that was used, to help, with battlefield targeting. I guess another, area, if you want to talk about warfighting styles, as militaries become more networked, and the actions of one unit are dependent on data sources coming from somewhere else and from combined arms operations. Being able to degrade the network battle system, so you don't have to take the data offline. You can just use cyber attack or other forms of influencing the data stream that units are getting, for instance, for targeting, like an artillery unit, for instance, just to make them not trust their data. It might cause them to hesitate. It might cause them to, to have to check back in with their commanders to make sure that, the data links that they're getting are not corrupted in some way, and that, can cause delay or, can cause degraded performance. And I guess that's something that's, potentially, I'm not sure we've even really seen it, but I can imagine it can be something that would be the case.
Great, thank you. What I've heard from the panel is, of course, is discussion of technology, new technologies like AI. We've talked about big data, social media, and I'm curious, going to the next question, in terms of with respect to issues and limitations in terms of military responses to this particular threat, but also in terms of international law. And I say this because law, of course, is very infamously slow to respond to new threats and new technologies. With respect to international humanitarian law, particularly, the issue of below the threshold, and of course, international law being, in this context, armed conflict. What is an armed conflict? Does the hybrid warfare and tactics amount and raise to the level of armed conflict, which would then be under the jurisdiction of international humanitarian law? And so one of the questions here, given this advancement in technology, what do you see in terms of the limitations here of international law? How can there be a response, a proper response to the international community to this particular threat? And if you have any comment as to also the responses in terms of limitations and issues about any military responses, particularly to a hybrid threat. I'm thinking here, of course, of military being kinetic primarily, if we think of those terms, to this non-kinetic type of force that's being used. And is it proper for the military to respond? And maybe, as Mr. Van Weel and others have commented, about civilian military cooperation in this particular area. So I'd like to hear any of your responses to that. So maybe, again, Mr. Van Weel, if you would start, we can have comment as we go through.
Sure, and don't quote me on this, but the kind of response in NATO, when it comes down to which kind of response we will give to an attack, we keep murky. And the reason we keep that murky is for strategic ambiguity, but also because when Article 5 was devised, nobody would have thought that the first time and the only time that it would be triggered would be as an effect of a terrorist attack in the US. So it is very difficult beforehand to delineate what you think will amount to something that deserves an attack. And I think it's the same with hybrid warfare. You could have a non-kinetic attack that could then result in, for example, the hospitals in a country being out of service with no backup power for 24 hours, and the amounts of that could be higher than by a border incursion with kinetic forces. So to delineate beforehand how do you respond to a specific hybrid attack, I think is very difficult. I think we will know it when we get there. When it comes down to the applicability of international humanitarian law, I think in the basis, that law is technology independent. And we've seen an example of this in the beginning of the war, when Ukraine was using facial recognition to identify the prisoners of war that they had captured, and then linked their identities to their social media profiles, called their loved ones, and publicized these profiles. Clearly, under the Geneva Convention, this is a violation of law. In this case, it was a technology that enabled it, but the act remains the act, and the law remains valid. I think where it becomes difficult is all software-based technology, because verification of reliability or adherence to international law of software-based solutions is going to be very hard. It is not like the verification of nuclear ballistic missiles, where you can actually go and look at a silo and verify whether or not there is a weapon in there or not, and at what stage it is. Here it's software. So you could claim to be adherent to international law in using AI and big data and adhering to privacy laws, whilst in the meantime you are not. And it is very difficult to devise something that would give us some kind of guarantee that the weapons we will be using in this next digital age will be compliant with international law. We at NATO would be very much in favor of having an international regime to be able to adhere to the international law as we know it now, but it will be very difficult to set it up.
Right, and of course that's the problem of attribution, state responsibility. Anyone else on the panel, Mr. Salm, if you would like to address, and just in terms of what you see as the limitations, and this is of course military or international law, if you have any observations about that.
Well, that's a good question. Clearly there are some well, the way we see how the international law functions is that there are huge liabilities that go with this, rules that you need to abide to, and all this. But there are also a lot of assets that come with this. Trade, trust, international cooperation, standards, rules that makes conducting your business much more easier. So now when someone manipulates or violates the law or tries to interpret the law in the ways that wasn't meant there, then the only answer that we might have as an international community is stick to the law and make sure that if you are violating, if you are not in position to respect the liabilities, then you shouldn't have access to the assets. And this is how we eventually impose this. And I think we have been fairly successful as an international community in doing this against Russian Federation. But still there is room to do more, to make sure that the international law actually works. And this is something that the hundreds of years and probably millions of hours that have been invested there isn't being wasted hours.
Main panelists, if you have any comments about, again, limitations in terms of military and/or legal responses.
Yeah, actually, when you're going back to the actual original kind of goal of conducting hybrid warfare, as I mentioned, it is about subversions, kind of detaching their local people's kind of patriotic minds and loyalties from their target governments. So it seems like these activities are kind of none of the business of military and legal kind of people in the first place. But that's the point. That gray area is the one that the aggressors are kind of taking advantage of. So in that sense, while military and a legal perspective does not directly relate, it seems like it does not directly relate to this issue, but it can make a more clarity in the process of escalations. When it comes to military, they can make a clear red line of when they will be responding to the hybrid threats. And also legal community should be, as you mentioned, they are very slow to adopt this new threats and new prescription. But at the same time, they have to be aware of how they can respond and punish, and where are kind of principles about how we can respond this hybrid threats in a legal perspectives. And you mentioned about this maritime security issues as well. And I know that it has been very long time since we have this legal approaches, and many kind of remnant countries are using this lawfare to respond to this hybrid warfares. But that's the point we can start about this, thinking about this hybrid warfare as well.
Thank you. Dr. Leo and Professor Ritchie, if you have any comments.
Yes, I have short comments for the response. But unfortunately, I don't have any clear answer for that now, but I think there are several considerations. The first is that it should be adequate, that's sufficient and appropriate, and it should be justified as well legally. But the thing is that the response by the military can be a tipping point of moving this situation from the peacetime to wartime. So we should be very considerate how to respond to the attacks in hybrid warfare. So one of the jobs for the military is to deterrence and do not escalate the situation by the decision makers. In that sense, it is very hard for the military to respond to the hybrid warfare attacks directly and on a large scale. Sometimes it can be better to spare them for the civilian side to handle and tackle these issues. So what I'm trying to say is that one of the characteristics of hybrid warfare is to blur the line between the peacetime and wartime. The military should be very careful when they have to involve. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Professor Ritchie.
Very briefly, with respect to international law, the short answer is I have no idea. Your guess is as good as mine. You're the lawyer. I guess, my big take here is, at least with respect to the hybrid part of hybrid warfare, I have a very difficult time imagining what international law can really meaningfully contribute, if for no other reason the enforcement aspect of this is going to be remarkably difficult. I fear that we're in a world where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, and I don't see why that would be different in this context. I guess the one small glimmer of hope, just to take one aspect of this, might be the 2021 to 2025 open-ended working group at the United Nations on ICTs and cyber. That might be something, the program of action that's been proposed there, that might be something. But given the state of affairs at the United Nations, and notably the in my estimation, very unconstructive role that Russia and China have been playing there, I don't have a great deal of hope there either.
Great, thank you. Your responses have sort of led me to sort of a question that follows through this as well. Is you've talked about rules-based international order, about the importance of international law maybe to this international community, despite the skepticism of international law from some. And we've also talked about democracies being vulnerable to hybrid warfare particularly. And so I'm curious as to your views as to whether international cooperation insofar as dealing with international hybrid warfare is something which can be done particularly because it affects democracies, among democracies themselves. Do we see wider cooperation beyond, let's say, democratic states? And so I'm curious as to your views about whether this international cooperation is feasible actually, and between who? NATO, of course, is doing a lot of work, but beyond NATO and others, and other groups and alliances, do you think that this can be done systematically as a whole, or do you think that there will be sort of regionalism or at least a conglomeration of like-minded states that are addressing the problem of hybrid warfare? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of these questions. Just in reverse order, maybe, just because we've gone to Mr. Van Wiel first, maybe Professor Ritchie, if you have any thoughts on that, and if we can just go back down the road.
I do. I have many thoughts about that, but I won't belabor the point. I mentioned in my own remarks, one of the two sort of bottom line up front points is international cooperation with like-minded partners. Notably, I did not say between democracies or between liberal states, or I said between like-minded partners. And the United States and South Korea and Japan, maybe let's say to take that trilateral, like-minded partners. Well, Russia, North Korea, and China are also perhaps like-minded partners, and they can also share best practices among what they consider to be best practices, and they can also share threat perceptions, and they can also support themselves militarily. So that's a value-neutral statement. So yes, I think the larger world that we're moving into, frankly speaking, the international order is in a phase of deterioration or transition or whatever you want to call it, is that we're going to see more regional blocks, and we're going to see blocks of states that tend to group together in like-minded ways and attempt to support each other. And that can include, obviously, authoritarian states doing that as well. How successful they're going to be is an open question. How successful democracies and liberal states are going to be in that is an open question. So far, the response, at least to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has augured well for Euro-Atlantic cooperation and the consolidation of solidarity between democracies, notably those that are allies of the United States, either in the multilateral framework of Nato or in the hub and spoke or network alliance here in the Asia Pacific, as well as with other partners. But I guess that's kind of my short answer is international cooperation, I think, is likely to take place more through those avenues, possibly also through some of the many lateral groupings that we've seen emerge both here in the Asia Pacific and in Europe as well. So I think those are places where we can look for this type of cooperation.
Okay, thank you. In the interest of time, I do want to have some time for questions from the floor. So maybe I'll abbreviate this discussion. And since we have someone from NATO here who's involved in international cooperation at this level, your thoughts about whether this is possible beyond potentially other states?
Yeah, I will focus because I'm from NATO and we are an alliance of democratic nations. I would say that we would focus on the vulnerabilities that we see of democracies when it comes down to disinformation and hybrid warfare. And it was mentioned by one of the speakers in the beginning that resilience is the ultimate and best protection, because resilience is something that we have in our own hands. How do we make our populations more resilient to disinformation? How do we make them more resilient to, for example, energy cuts, which might ask for sacrifices this winter, but for the greater good. I think our new soon-to-be member states, Sweden and Finland, can be a great example to other democracies in how do you create resilience amongst your population. And for example, in Sweden, every citizen has got a folder from the government what to do in case of an attack on the nation. And one of the rules, number one is, and I'm paraphrasing because I haven't read it in a while, is that we will never surrender. So don't believe any messages that the government has surrendered. Now, if you look at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, there was a deep fake from Zelensky produced by the Russian Federation, asking the Ukrainian armed forces to lay down their arms. Fortunately, deepfakes nowadays are still recognizable and it didn't have a large impact. But in the very near future, that will not be the case. So to have a population that knows what their government expects from them, where they can go to contribute to this whole of society approach, and to a certain extent take care of themselves, I think will be key in the next technological era.
Well, thank you. We have 10 minutes remaining in the session. I want to be mindful of any potential questions from the floor. So at this point, I'd like to maybe offer time for anyone from the floor who may have any questions for any of the panel members before we maybe get to a final question and conclude. So anyone from the floor who would like to ask a question to the panelists. Yes, I think there's a gentleman in the back.
예, 오늘 아침 이른 아침부터
I would like to express my gratitude to all the panel members for your contributions and your discussions. I am Yoon Chang-gyu, professor at Kookmin University. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Van Vale from NATO.
전쟁이 발발한 이후
After the war has broken out, do you believe that NATO had played a sufficient role? Well, it seems that the war is now expanding into an energy war because Putin is now manipulating the supply of gas. And so when winter hits, there will be difficulties among EU member states that may lead to fragmentation of solidarity in the EU. And so from NATO's perspective, for example, do you believe that it's a possibility that NATO can actually be involved in military operations? That is my question to you.
Really, the question is directed to you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I have to refer to the core task of NATO, which is to protect the alliance and its allies from any attacks. So the initial action that NATO took after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine was to shield the Allied territory. Around 140,000 troops were moved to the eastern border of the alliance, hundreds of aircraft, and a lot of troops have been put under the central command of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So the message of that was very clear to Putin and to Russia that every inch of Allied territory would be defended. At the same time, we have tried to stand behind Ukraine in defending itself against the Russian invasion as best as we can. And we've all seen that there's been an increase in the amount of support that we have been given over time as the needs of the Ukrainians have changed. NATO never intended to get into a direct confrontation with the Russian Federation. We didn't at the beginning of this war, and still we don't consider NATO to be a part of this conflict. That doesn't take away that from a Kremlin perspective, the pressure is now being put on by using hybrid means like energy to try to create unrest and put pressure on the politicians in the West, especially with the coming winter, to change their course. I think here I will share the optimism of my neighbor in saying that up until now we have seen that the more pressure is applied, the more unity has arisen within the Euro-Atlantic area. So yes, I do expect we will see difficulties. We will have to cut demands for this winter, and we will probably make it until the end. But I think the lesson all nations will learn is that this dependency has not served us well and cannot return.
Well, thank you for the response. Any other questions we have from the floor? Yes, I believe there's a question over here to our right.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Hyde. I'm with the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. A number of you have mentioned democracy in connection with this, and you've cited it as a vulnerability in terms of hybrid war. I wonder if, sort of red teaming it, you could flip it around and say, does democracy actually bring some advantages in hybrid war in terms of responding to hybrid threats and hybrid attacks? Thank you.
Would anyone like to take a response to that in terms of the comment about democracies being particularly vulnerable, but the flip side being democracies could actually be very resilient in and of themselves against hybrid threats? Professor?
Yeah, actually, I agree with that arguments that when you look at this current hybrid warfare, democracy has been very vulnerable to the hybrid threat in the first place because of its own kind of characteristics and open society, kind of freedom of speech. All of this inherent characteristics make democracy more vulnerable. But at the same time, as you mentioned, it could be more resilient as well. But at this point, when you look at most of democracies are kind of declining, not only the United States, but also most of consolidated democracies are kind of declining because of the polarizations and income inequality, all of these issues. So it becomes more often it become the victims, but at the same time it has own its resilience as well. It depends on how these governments and politicians take advantage of this situation in the first place.
Yeah, it reminds me of a discussion that's happening, of course, across many democracies about the impact of constitutional law, of course, on these issues of free speech, as well as other sort of inherent sort of constitutional rights. And that becomes to, I think, a question that arises on this particular matter. And I think it seems like the jury, of course, is still out as to the long-term effects because of the problems that we see in various countries about fake news and other kinds of disinformation that has come out, and the role of the media, particularly in those particular countries as to this particular issue. Yes, Professor Ritchie, you would like to respond.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, I think it depends on what you're talking about, which type of hybrid threat you're talking about. So yeah, I think the consensus tends to be that technological progress, innovation, invention, those kinds of things tend to be superior in states with open information ecosystems, and to the extent that that plays an important part in hybrid threats and feeding into hybrid warfare, there's something where I think democracies have an advantage. I mean, I think where we talk about the risks to democracies and the sort of peculiar vulnerabilities they have, it comes, on the flip side, from the fact that they are open and they do have a political system where, subversion and polarization become, overtly possible in a way that they aren't in authoritarian systems. And those authoritarian systems have their own brittleness, of course. So they also have risks. It's just they're different or peculiar risks in authoritarian systems versus those in democracies, I think.
Okay, well, thank you. Any other questions that we may have from the floor? Okay, well, seeing none, I'd like to ask maybe one final question. We do have about 5 minutes left in this session. The last question is, how should the roles of the military and civil sector be divided in response to hybrid warfare? We've heard the blurring of the lines, so to speak, between civilian efforts as well as military efforts. And because this is a session on the role of the military, the role of the civilian side, of course, hasn't been discussed in full, but this maybe gives us an opportunity to address that question briefly. So maybe giving a 1 or 2 minutes response. I know that's not enough time to respond to this particular question, but maybe if there's comments from the panel, and maybe begin with Mr. Sam, if you have any comments on that, and then we can sort of go through the panel as well to conclude.
Well, I think the main conclusion is that security and defense is not only MOD's business. It's the business of people who deal with energy, the people who deal with trade, the people who deal with tourism, economists, and so forth. So clearly it needs to be more widespread. But there's one more notion I want to give to the audience here, that just to end with a more positive note. In the last 30 years, after the collapse of Soviet Union, there's a pretty solid strategic symmetry that has been built up. International law, as we discussed, trade, energy relations, and all this. Now it's been disrupted. And clearly from, looking from a Russian side, we are currently in the situation where, well, basically there are no strategic dilemmas that we might impose to them. Well, there is basically no questions that they can ask themselves that, oh, we cannot do this because they will impose us this sanction. Well, there is nothing left, almost nothing left. There is no sort of political sanctions saying that we will kick you out from some sort of institutions, because they have been outcast from many of them already. But the strategic symmetry will settle, and it's our job and our sort of political mission to make sure that the Western or like-minded world will come out stronger. And I'm quite confident that eventually we will, and eventually the rule of law, the ability of people to self-determinate themselves, freedom of speech, and all this will prevail. And this will be the recipe for success for all the free people around the world.
Okay. Well, thank you. Professor Jung, Dr. Lee, or Professor Ritchie, if you have any comments on the potential cooperation between the military sector as well as civil society.
I guess Dr. Lee mentions during his comment about these issues, and actually this hybrid warfare is actually needs more whole of a government's approach in the sense that everything is very gray, and we really not sure where the threat is coming from and where to it will be escalating in the future. So in that sense, it is not just the role of the military but the civil society, as many of the panelists mentioned, and also kind of international legal kind of cooperation is most important in the sense that they are setting the kind of rule-based order in the sense that they are making our workings of international orders more predictable. So given that under this discussions, the role of the military should be discussed and how they're going to set the kind of rules of engagement in the first place and how they're going to put the red line about how to punish these aggressors and how international communities are actually kind of cooperating in all different levels.
Thank you. Dr. Lee or Professor Ritchie?
Yes, I think that the cooperation between the military and civilians are necessarily indispensable and very desirable. And as I already mentioned, the hybrid warfare blurs many things. For example, it blurs the lines between peacetime and wartime. It blurs the concept of weapons, non-physical weapons and physical weapons. And like this, we have to note one more thing, is that it blurs the lines between the risk and threat. And the making people safe against risk and making people secure against threats. But these two distinctions between the risk and threats are very blurred. It means that the military should be cooperating with the civilians to tackle both of them in this age of hybrid warfare. And that's the civilians too.
Okay, well, Mr. Ritchie, we have a few time, maybe a minute for your response.
Not even. I don't even need that. In the case of the US, at least, in most democracies, I think superficially this question is very easy. The military is under civilian control, basta. The military has an obligation to provide advice at the highest level to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to the civilian government, but they also have an obligation to follow the legal orders of those civilian political leaders who either do or don't take that advice. And so I think that the military's advice that they give should be to do the things that they're good at and let the either government or the private sector handle the things that they're better at.
And maybe we'll give Mr. Van Weel the final word on this question.
Yeah, I'll keep it very short, and I very much agree with those that say that this is a team sport. It's not about delineating what is my responsibility, what is the other. Every player is good at what it's good at, and in this modern type of warfare, we need all those players to come together and then to decide who's the better actor at what point in time to which specific action to get to a good result.
Well, thank you for the responses. This will now conclude our plenary session on the role of the military in hybrid warfare. Would you please join me in thanking our panel for their excellent presentations?
And distinguished guests, please join me in thanking our moderator as well as the panelists for the great and passionate deliberations. Thank you very much. Well, that concludes all of the 3 plenary sessions for the Seoul Defense Dialogue 2022. Once again, we thank all of the panelists as well as the moderators for fruitful and thought-provoking discussions. That concludes all of the plenary sessions, ladies and gentlemen. We will now take a short break before we move on to our closing ceremony. So once again, we will break and resume at 11:30 a.m. for our our closing ceremony, so please enjoy the break. Before you do, I would like to ask you to please fill out our survey for the betterment of future Seoul Defense Dialogue conferences. And of course, for our interpretation guides, please leave them on the table if you are to go outside into the conference lobby. With that, I will leave you to the break, and I will see you back here in just about 30 minutes. Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin our closing ceremony. We kindly would like to ask all of our guests to please take their seats. We will soon begin. Thank you once again for your attendance, and please refer to our interpretation guides if you do require interpretation. Thank you once again for attending the closing ceremony of Seoul Defense Dialogue 2022. Once again, I greet you. My name is Ju Yeon Cho, and it is indeed an honor to be hosting this third and final day and the closing ceremony. So let us begin in earnest the closing ceremony. So it's been a long and busy, and I hope quite fruitful 3 days. And so during the 3 days of the Seoul Defense Dialogue, we have been through a lot of different conferences as well as meetings. So we have put together a short video clip with various different photos for a recap of the precious moments. So with that, please turn your attention to the screen. I think that was a testament of how hard we worked over the last 3 days. So thank you once again for your cooperation and your invaluable input to make this a success. So we looked at how to address complex security challenges, fostering international solidarity. And we had 3 major plenary sessions looking at denuclearization of North Korea, fostering peace and cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and lastly today, we discussed the role of military in hybrid warfare. So thank you once again to all of the discussants and presentations, as well as the moderators. With that, I believe that it's a great segue to winding down on the 3 days and introducing our closing remarks. And the Honorable Vice Minister Pum Chul-shin, the Vice Minister of National Defense of the Republic of Korea. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is time to conclude Seoul Defense Dialogue 2022. Despite the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic around the world, so many government delegates and representatives of international organizations have come to Seoul and participated actively in the sessions that we have organized. Thanks to your active participation, the 11th Seoul Defense Dialogue has been able to close with great success. This year's Seoul Defense Dialogue holds much significance for me as well. During the SDD, I was able to meet with government delegates and private sector security experts in person and listen to them discussing numerous security challenges faced by the international community, which was invaluable experiences for me. I believe that the views, suggestions, and insights shared by the participants for the past 3 days will provide valuable guidance as the Korean government and the Ministry of National Defense continue to respond to the current security challenges. Through the discussions at this year's SDD, we learned that the newly emerging security threats faced by the humanity are indeed unprecedented in terms of complexity and severity, and we were reminded once again of the importance of solidarity and coordination of the international community to respond to these new challenges. In the first plenary session, where I participated in the panel discussion, we discussed ways to pursue denuclearization of North Korea and shared the view that the principled approaches are necessary to achieve complete and verifiable denuclearization. It was discussed that the international community must implement North Korean sanctions effectively while showing to the North Korean regime the actual benefits that they will enjoy if they give up on their nuclear ambition so that the DPRK would make the right strategic decision. Recently, the government is developing concrete plans for the realization of the audacious initiative, and these discussions will help the government to do so. In addition, the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific region is growing, and the political and military tensions in the region are rising as well. Therefore, it was very timely and meaningful to discuss security issues of the Indo-Pacific region in the second plenary session. Our government is currently in the process of developing our own Indo-Pacific strategic framework, and we were able to see that the international community wants Korea to play a bigger role, going beyond the Korean Peninsula to contribute to establishing a rules-based global order. Furthermore, discussions on the hybrid warfare and the role of the media that are adding more complexity to the current security landscape, and as a multilateral military dialogue platform, SCD engaged in discussions on military science and technology and military acquisition and operation systems, and these discussions were also very meaningful. Furthermore, the Cyber Working Group held in 3 years and the first Space Security Working Group were attended by more delegates than expected. At the working groups, the participants assessed the current status on ever-increasing non-conventional security threats and discussed ways to respond to these threats. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, As many distinguished participants emphasized during the SDD, security threats in one region, be it conventional or non-conventional, are not confined to any particular country or any particular region. It has become very evident by the global impact of the war in Ukraine. The war has caused energy and food challenges around the world and promoted the formation of regional blocs. The security threats faced by the humanity are becoming more complex and challenging. But as we have shared through the 3 days of heated discussions, if the international community continues to engage in communication and dialogue with one another and strengthen global solidarity, I am very confident that we will be able to find clues to the solutions of the problems that we have at hand. In this process, the Korean government will strengthen solidarity with countries that share values and do its part as a responsible member of the international community. The Seoul Defense Dialogue was launched 10 years ago in an effort to contribute to global peace. In order for the SDD to continue to grow its role and influence in the next decade and beyond, I would like to ask for your active support and participation. I hope that the pandemic will be completely over next year so that we can invite more people here in Seoul next year. I have one more sentence to finish, but before that, I would like to express my gratitude to so many people who have worked so hard to prepare for this event. First of all, here with us, we have officials from the Ministry of National Defense. Please rise from your seats. Thank you so much for your hard work. Without your hard work and dedication, this event would not have been made possible. Furthermore, we have many staff members who are at the back, especially the young officers who have been guiding you through the past 3 days. Please give them a big round of applause. Also, we have so many volunteers on the left-hand side of myself. There are so many volunteers. Thank you for your dedication. And last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to all of those vice ministers and high-level government officials from abroad. Please stand up. Please rise from your seat. For those distinguished participants from overseas, thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you. And I hope to be able to see you again next year. Please make sure to come here and grace us with your attendance. And I hope that you will share your insights, your wisdom, and your experiences at next year's SDD as well. With that, let us conclude the 2022 Seoul Defense Dialogue. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Honorable Vice Minister, thank you very much for your closing remarks. Thank you very much, and I believe that it was very touching for all of us indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we have heard from the closing remarks, complex security challenges are some issues that we cannot address as a nation alone, and we have to tackle all together. And I believe the past 3 days have taught us a valuable lesson that slowly but surely we'll be able to make collective progress all towards a common goal of addressing these complex security challenges and fostering international solidarity altogether. So I would like to take this opportunity once again to thank all of your attendances as well as your invaluable contributions to make this conference successful. I hope, albeit short, that you have enjoyed your stay in Seoul, and you are always welcome back to Seoul or the Republic of Korea. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you again next year. Thank you very much. Ladies and